Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us at the market site in Times Square, New York City, we have Christos Makridis. He's a Stanford Digital Fellow as well as co-founder of Living Opera. We're going to discuss how businesses and consumers need to approach data privacy and all the new technologies like AI that we have been speaking about. Christos, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to TradeTalks.
Thank you so much, Jill. Great to be here.
Let's talk about the relative safety of many white-collar jobs thought that could see extinction with the introduction of all these new technologies. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I think one of my favorite quotes comes from Eric Brynjolfsson, who runs the Digital Economy Lab at Stanford's Human-Centered AI Institute, and he talks about how the lawyers of the future aren't going to be replaced by AI. It's going to be the lawyers that know how to use AI replacing the lawyers that don't know how to use AI. And so the way that I think about a lot of technology is that it can be very labor augmenting, and as a result, people can become more productive. But there's a lot of intentionality that we need to learn how to use technology for our benefit rather than being a slave to it. And so in the case of generative AI, there's so many different possibilities that are now out there where we can use it to build a skeleton of a draft. We can use it to search much more effectively. So there's a lot of possibilities to augment our productivity now.
It's interesting. We have a variety of industries that come on the show talking about the different ways that they can use generative AI, and it's been pretty unanimous across the board, legal being one of them, of course. Contract work takes so much time.
Yeah.
Let generative AI manage that. Let's work on more complex cases and research, and you can apply it to, I've had jewelry designers come in and say, oh, they're pulling different design elements for us, but we ultimately make that decision. So I would agree with you there. I think it's a complement to become more efficient and more creative.
Definitely. And I like that you brought up the complex work, because one of the big barriers to doing work in teams is that things can be very complicated to explain. There's this concept of transaction costs. And so one of my recent research papers creates this measure of how difficult is it to coordinate among different team members. And we find that the relationship between exposure to ChatGPT, i.e. the probability that that job will be replaced by ChatGPT, it's not, the jobs that require more coordination are actually not more likely to be replaced by ChatGPT. In fact, it's likely to complement your productivity. So I really think that there's something about complex work being made easier to do and not being at risk of being replaced by it. It'll be more of a complement.
Right. I mean, the whole thing is, too, some of these meetings can be so inefficient. You can never get schedules together, so if you can get that basic framework out of the way, which is like the busy work, then you can start, thinking about your calendar in a more effective way. Consumers and businesses, and I think ChatGPT is really catching on because there's such a consumer focus.
Right.
Everyone gets it. It's not like when crypto and blockchain were launched, it was very enterprise.
Yeah, it's not esoteric. Yeah.
Everybody gets it for the most part. So when you think about data privacy and mitigating these cybersecurity issues, what kind of steps do consumers and businesses need to take?
Yeah, I think there's a short-run strategy of just being very mindful about when you do use a plugin, what are you saying yes to? And if you have any hesitance, maybe hold off, because there's this concept of an option value that you can always say yes in the future. So be clear about what you're saying yes to when you, if you're using a Google profile, for example, and you're just plugging in there, maybe just create a new profile and don't do it through Google, because then you just kind of bundles. And then secondly, I think in the medium to long run, I think non-fungible tokens will be used a lot more for managing people's data, because NFTs provide a vehicle for storing data much more securely, and they can be unique to an individual. So I think that's one of the keys in the longer run.
Let's talk about some of the risks here, because you and I are talking about sectors, but that doesn't mean each company is going to use it in a unanimous way where everyone's using it in the same way. What are some of the leading indicators? How should companies be thinking about this?
Yeah, well, I think as you said, every sector is going to use technology a little bit differently. What makes AI so unique is that it's what's called a general purpose technology. So the way that the legal profession uses it is going to be different than restaurants use it. But what I think every organization and markets as a whole need to do is take an inventory of what does success from the consumer's perspective look like, and do an inventory around what tasks are needed in order to make the consumer happy. And when you understand those tasks, you can figure out, can they be augmented by AI? Can they be replaced by AI? How do AI and humans work together to deliver that value to the consumer? But if you don't have an inventory of what's required to deliver that end product or service, then you're just going to be kind of going based off of wherever the wind blows. So I think organizations need to take that human capital inventory, especially now, because so much has changed.
And your research focuses on the growing digitization of finance. And we've seen that happen across the board, whether it's the exchanges, it's trading platforms, it's banking, hence, this explosion we've seen in fintech. You have to be digitized in order to survive in the financial services sector. Do you think AI and these newer technologies is going to be part of that digitization? Do you need to have that incorporated in order to stay competitive?
Yeah, definitely. We've seen a big rise in the share of workers that have a STEM background in finance, especially among the larger banks. I think that poses challenges for small and mid-sized banks that might not have the budget to actually hire more expensive data scientists. I think that's something that I'm working on myself to try to provide solutions and software for it. But I definitely think that AI and more generally technology has to be part of financial services and how to use it. Now, the way that a small bank uses AI is going to be different than a JP Morgan or a Bank of America, but undoubtedly has to be part of that digital strategy. And so even though they might not be the innovators in the sense of you don't need to create a new technique, a new statistical technique. You might just use something off the shelf, but apply it in a very efficient way. So being aware of what's possible and then figuring out how to deploy it, that's a skill that's not incredibly technical. You have to have some technical familiarity, but you don't need to be a machine learning engineer. You just need to have that broad operational knowledge to understand how to deploy it.
And that's such a great point that you made. I had this conversation earlier with an AI company and how the role of the CFO is changing.
Yeah.
Technology and operations is becoming a big part of what they are responsible for. Even the reporting structure is shifting a bit. In your research, are you also thinking about the ethics and the responsible use of ChatGPT and other generative AI?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's been a proliferation of what are called trustworthy AI principles. And those principles are very important because they provide some guardrails, an ethical framework. And so there's things around accessibility, transparency. The White House had released 9 different principles for trustworthy AI. But then how do you map that into action? And so every industry and every organization needs to figure out, what does this principle look like in action? Because if it just stays up in the clouds, then people can say, yeah, we're being ethical, and what do you really mean by it?
It's arbitrary, right?
Yeah, so I think there need to be clear use cases around how it gets operationalized, and then people study the use cases, and you figure out, where do we make a mistake? How can we do things better in the future? So drilling down to specifics, I think, is very important.
From a regulatory perspective, do you think we're there? Do you think a framework can be developed around this?
Oh boy, well, I think this debate between regulation versus standards is very, my personal belief is that standards can do a lot better in environments that have high ambiguity. Because when you create a regulation, that produces a very kind of narrow box and guardrails around what is allowed and what is not allowed. Standards promote a set of best practices. So when there's a lot of uncertainty in an environment, those best practices can allow more flexibility. And so I think right now what we really need is more innovation on the standards side to develop, because right now, we don't really know what to regulate. What would be good to say yes to? And you don't want to curtail innovation. So I think that there is this symbiotic relationship between regulation and standards, and what we should move into now is defining what are the best practices. And that's been done before in other sectors. You think about W3C and the standards that emerged in the internet and for digital credentials. So I think those can be done in cybersecurity. They kind of have been done a little bit in cybersecurity with what the National Institute for Standards and Technology have done, but it can also be done in AI. We have yet to see those best practices emerge yet, though.
I just feel like we've had such a challenge with Web 2.0, right? And thinking about data privacy and content moderation and what's safe. And again, that's kind of very arbitrary. What
Yes.
I might deem as hate speech might be something completely different to you. And because of the uniqueness of our First Amendment and everything, a whole different conversation. I'm just hoping that Web 3.0, perhaps we will have learned from what we could not get done in Web 2.
I think one thing that gives me a lot of hope and optimism about it is that Web3 allows us to create markets around information. So right now, when your data is being harvested from a Google or from Facebook or whatnot, they're basically harvesting that for free, and then they're packaging up and selling that data to advertisers. So there's not really a market that exists for information. With the use of NFTs, now you can create markets, and that will change the underlying incentives that companies will have, so that you don't get as much bad content out there, so individuals are aware what they're consenting to be visible, and so on. So I think that there's a lot of things that can change, but you're totally right that we haven't figured this out for Web 2, and so we need to take baby steps and start piloting different ideas and see how they go.
All right, Christos, we appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade
Thank you,
Talks.
Jill.
And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.